Some voices don't just fill a room. They settle into the walls, and decades later, the people who were there still carry the sound somewhere behind their ribs. David Phelps has that kind of voice. Not the kind that impresses you and moves on, but the kind that quietly rewires what you expect from music, from faith, from what the human throat is actually capable of producing. Which makes what he said in a recent interview so worth sitting with. He wasn't on stage. No spotlight, no congregation holding its breath. Just a man, calm and unhurried, closing a door that millions of people had always assumed would stay open. The quietness of how he did it, without anger and without grief, is what this is actually about. Gospel music has produced extraordinary tenors. But what Baylor University gave back to the Christian music world in the early 1990s, after David finished his formal vocal training there, went past technique into something harder to categorize. Born in Tomball, Texas in 1970, David came to music the way certain people come to faith, not by choosing it so much as by being unable to avoid it. By his mid-20s, the development was impossible to miss, and in 1994, Bill Gaither made the phone call that would reshape the Gaither vocal band sound for a generation. David said yes, and what followed became woven into the fabric of American gospel music and Christian worship in a way that none of them could have predicted at the time. For the fans who discovered faith through the homecoming recordings of the 1990s and early 2000s, David wasn't simply a talented member of a vocal group. He was the voice that reached the upper register on Jerusalem and held a note so purely that grown men in the audience bowed their heads without thinking about it. Standing alongside Bill Gaither, Guy Penrod, and Mark Lowry on those homecoming stages, he held his own, and on the right nights made even the veterans turn and look. Those recordings traveled into living rooms and church basements and long family car rides across America, and for millions of people who grew up watching them, David's voice became part of the soundtrack of their faith. That history is exactly why what he has been saying in recent years carries the weight it does. Not loudly, not dramatically, with the steady clarity of someone who made peace with a decision long before the conversation became public. His first departure from the Gaither vocal band came in 2004, and the surface explanation held together reasonably well at the time. He wanted to build a solo ministry on his own terms. He had a young family and wanted to be more present in their lives. He carried an artistic vision that the vocal group format could only partially contain. All of that was true, and David returned to the group in 2007, and for a while it felt like something had been made whole again. But the years between those 2 points told a story that the schedule alone couldn't carry. Touring demands payment from something, and David and his wife Lori were raising their children through those years, doing the arithmetic that every traveling artist eventually has to face. The road gives certain things and quietly takes others, and across a decade, the math doesn't always come out the way you hoped. David has spoken about this with the measured honesty that his audience has always recognized as genuine. No blame aimed at the Gaither organization, no complaint about the demands of the road itself, just a clear-eyed account of what those years cost alongside what they produced. His daughter Maggie has grown into a performer in her own right, inheriting her father's voice in a way that has left audiences genuinely stunned. The pride David carries when he speaks about his children, about the life he and Lori have built together across 3 decades of marriage and ministry, isn't a side note in this story. That life is the center of it, the thing he consistently points back to when explaining choices that look surprising from the outside. And then there's the layer that most coverage of David Phelps has been unwilling to name directly. A voice is an instrument, and every instrument is mortal, even when the spirit driving it isn't. Every singer who operates at David's level, reaching those notes and performing with that kind of sustained intensity, night after night across 30 years, carries a quiet understanding of what that costs physically. David, now 55, has been open about the reality of maintaining his voice at this stage of a career built on doing things with sound that most trained singers never attempt. He has spoken about the discipline required, about what his voice can and cannot do now compared to what it could do at 30. And for anyone listening carefully to his recent conversations, a pattern becomes clear. His solo concerts, his more selective appearances, the way he frames his current work, all of it sounds less like artistic preference and more like stewardship. Protecting what remains, being truthful with himself and with the people who have followed his tenor voice for decades about what that protection actually requires of him now. Calling this decline would be a mistake, and it would miss the point entirely. David Phelps at 55 still delivers moments that stop audiences cold, and the artistry behind those moments has only deepened across the years. What has shifted is the calculation around how he deploys that gift, and whether the structure of a touring vocal group with its fixed calendar and collective demands fits the kind of careful stewardship his voice now genuinely needs. The answer he arrived at, gradually and without visible bitterness, is that it doesn't. And that answer, once fully formed in him, was not going to be walked back. What nobody watching the early Homecoming recordings expected was that David's most direct statements about calling would come not in some dramatic announcement, but across a series of quiet conversations, each one a little more settled than the last. He has spoken about wanting his concerts to feel like actual conversations with the people in the room, about wanting the faith dimension of his work to sit in the foreground rather than behind the spectacle of the vocal performance, about the difference between being a world-class voice inside a world-class ensemble and being a minister who happens to carry a world-class voice. That distinction is not subtle to the people who know him and have watched this shift happen across years of reflection. Lori Phelps, in her own public appearances alongside David, has said much the same thing in her own words and with her own warmth. She has spoken about their life together, about the family they raised through those touring years, and about what she calls the second chapter of David's ministry. Not a lesser chapter, a different one, built around the life they chose deliberately rather than the life the road had been quietly choosing for them. What both of them communicate, in separate conversations and in shared ones, is the calm that belongs to people who thought something through all the way, decided it fully, and moved forward without looking back for validation. David Phelps is not the first extraordinary voice to leave the Gaither vocal band circle without returning on any permanent basis. Michael English, whose tenure with the group in the late 1980s and early 1990s produced some of the most celebrated recordings in the entire Homecoming catalog, found his way toward an independent ministry that suited a different season of his life and calling. Russ Taff, another voice of almost frightening emotional power and depth, has worked largely outside the formal Gaither vocal band structure for most of the past 2 decades, though his appearances in the broader Homecoming community have remained deeply treasured. What these departures share isn't bitterness or conflict or the kind of rupture that leaves damage behind. Each of these men arrived by his own route and in his own time at a recognition that a certain calling requires a certain freedom, and that the framework which serves an artist at one stage of a career doesn't always serve him at another. Bill Gaither has understood this better than almost anyone in the gospel world. Across various conversations and public statements over the years, he has communicated that what he has always wanted for the artists in his orbit is genuine flourishing, rather than a performance of loyalty. The Homecoming recordings were never designed to freeze these voices in amber. They were celebrations of what was alive in particular people at particular moments, and when those people move into new seasons, the celebration doesn't end. It moves with them into whatever comes next. David and Bill have maintained a relationship built on mutual respect and real affection that survives the distance. No estrangement lives in this story, only an honest acknowledgement of what passed between them and what has begun since, and in the gospel community, where authenticity is the currency that everything else gets purchased with. That kind of honesty carries more weight than any reunion tour could provide. What comes next for David Phelps and his family is something his audience will follow with the same attention they have given the past 30 years of his singing career. He is not disappearing, and he is not stepping back from music or from ministry. He is doing what the most self-aware artists eventually do when faith and honesty are both pulling in the same direction. He is following the specific thread of his calling wherever it leads, protecting the instrument that makes that possible, and refusing to let nostalgia make decisions that belong to clarity. Maggie Phelps has already shown the world that the gift passes down. Lori has shown what it looks like to build a life alongside someone whose voice belongs in some fundamental way to far more people than just you, and to do that with grace and groundedness across 3 decades. And David himself has shown the gospel community something they may not have expected from the young tenor who held that impossibly high note on a homecoming stage back in 1994. He has shown them what it looks like to grow up in public, to let a calling evolve without apology, and to do all of it with honesty and tact. The question this story genuinely leaves open isn't really about David Phelps at all. It's about legacy and what that word means when applied to a voice like his. When a voice this rare has said what it came to say in one context and moved into another, what remains? The recordings certainly remain, and the performances preserved on screen and in the memories of the people who were in those rooms. But something harder to name remains alongside them, the sense that the most important music David Phelps will ever make may still be ahead. Not the music of the homecoming stage, but something quieter, something fitted to the chapter he and Lori are living right now. Whatever that music turns out to be, the people who have followed this ministry for 30 years or 40 years know one thing without needing to be told. This story is not finished.